welcome to the second episode of the Sisyphus complex solution. I'll give a thanks to those people that have already subscribed and liked and watched the first episode. This particular one is entitled What Government Looks Like, and from the feedback that I had from the first one, I'll give a note of thanks to Christina for having made that suggestion. I was intending to do something similar to that, but completely forgotten, so that's a perfect example as to why feedback is important. Some of the things that you're going to be wanting to understand with this new episode is different barnet. Managed to get my hair cut in time before the lockdown came into force. That started yesterday. Absolute nonsense, but there you go. So things are going to be done in a slightly different fashion in this episode, so we're starting to build into how the process actually works, in so much as that there's a few things that I want to talk about in terms of how we start to think about things going forward before I start to lay out what the step-by-step process is. And I'm also going to do things a little bit arse about face as well, because I'm going to start off with the F.O.W.E.F.U.N, the F to World Economic Forum and the United Nations, prior to doing the initial steps of how we start to look into what government looks like. So, how long this is, if this is going to be as long as the last one, I've got no idea, but hopefully not, because I think that was a bit too long last time. But anyway, one of the things that I wanted to encourage, really, for people to be able to think about different things when they're understanding how it is that they want to, or what they perceive of what government should look like, assuming you had some level of input and ability to be able to shape the way that government was put together in the future. I saw a couple of other YouTube programs this week on this occasion, and that it's the two Weinstein brothers, or Weinstein. I'd never know how to pronounce these people's names. But anyway, I don't normally watch the Weinstein brothers because they are a little bit more left-leaning to me, and one is a little bit highfalutin for me, a little bit too much of the psychology. But anyway, it just so happened that I was watching these guys this week, and there was some interesting points that they were making in terms of the questions raised, because it's one of the issues that we do tend to find where they will have these very in-depth conversations, but at the end of it, you're seldom any the wiser. You're not really coming up with any kind of solutions, but if it makes you think, then that's basically hitting the nail on the head. Now, in terms of the Brett Weinstein and Douglas Murray, the picture at the top there was one question that was raised where, again, obviously there was no particular answer given, but it was just to beg the question as to what is the justification for wanting to change any government or structure of government, whether it's an ideological perspective, whether it's an economic perspective, things of this nature. What's the real reason for wanting to do that? Now, my fag's gone out. Now, the thing about that is, obviously we're seeing a whole range of political nonsense and shenanigans going on at the moment, where I think I mentioned last week as well that it's not getting any better, with people just rampaging around and that, and just shouting complete meaningless drivel. If you've got something to protest about, if you've got something to complain about, if you've got something to be concerned about, you have to have at least some understanding as to what it is that you are complaining about and what it is that you want to see it replaced with. It can't just be this very minimalistic and short level of outrage perspective. It has to be a little bit more in depth than that. So what we need to be considering is what is the reason for us wanting some level of change. And it occurs to me at least, that the biggest problems that we come across are the levels of corruption, lack of accountability, the transparency side of things, and that is a slightly unusual one, because they are actually a little bit more transparent than most people actually realise. But at the same time, there is also the problem of hiding in plain sight. So I'd like people to just give a little bit of thought as to, if you're looking towards having some level of change is how the government is run, for what reason? What is it you think is the problem, and then what is it that you think is going to be the potential solution for that? Now, this is just a start point for those considerations, because as I've said previously, you need to be able to understand what government looks like as a whole, what the entire process is, before you start going, right, this is the solution and this is how I want to implement it, because there could be knock-on effects to that. So it's just one of those questions that to get people thinking a little bit more. And then from the conversation between Eric Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, I don't know, and Peter Thiel, was a bit of an issue around singularity of thought. Now, what that alludes to is an issue that's currently quite a problem in terms of the Chinese flu, where, at least in terms of the UK, I mean, obviously there are a lot of countries and that are running very similar sorts of processes and that make very, very little sense. It's a case of we're going to be led by the science, the science, which essentially means that you'll have people like that, was it Neil Ferguson, and then you've got F.O.W.E.F.U.N. in America and so forth, where they're supposed to be, if I can pronounce this as well, epidemiologists. I'll put my teeth back in. But policies are being made on the back of people who have a singular and sometimes entirely debatable level of expertise. So why anybody would consider having that singularity as thought as to be the defining advice across the board it literally makes no sense whatsoever. And it is something that I've noticed across a whole range of different sectors. You have a very similar problem where you need to have people that have got a little bit more variety of their expertise, at least even on the input level, so that somebody else can look at the overlying, but more of a holistic picture. So trying to combat that kind of issue as well, that is something else, and that ideally we'd all start to be thinking about, because if we have the interest to understand what government looks like anyway, we have to look across the board at all different aspects of policy making. And you cannot have just one particular level of expertise. You can take one level of expertise and say, right, okay, this is the area where I can have the best input, but you can't or shouldn't expect a decision to be made purely on the basis of that. Now, there are other sectors rather, and that are a fairly good example of this, which are in the automotive and the aerospace sectors, where an awful lot of the manufacturing advances, some of the technologies and some of the processes and engineering expertise that they have within automotive has very direct transferable skills to aerospace and even into the marine sector and rail sector, things of this nature. But they very seldom actually share that knowledge, and it's a very unusual way of doing things, because especially if you're looking at the manufacturing process, they do have commonalities. So what you do tend to find within those types of sectors is it depends on what the margins are. So you tend to have a little bit of a a perspective of feeling that they're a little, perhaps a little bit a feeling of being slightly one above the other. So in the automotive sector, for example, the margins are actually not that high. Naturally, that can depend on the type of vehicle manufacturer that you're looking at, but even at the high end, and that the margins are not massive. You might see a car with a very big price tag, but it doesn't necessarily mean the margins are high. Yet within aerospace, the margins are absolutely enormous, because obviously the price tag is also enormous. The number of units that they will produce are an awful lot less. So there tends to be, just purely on the basis of that margin, a kind of a standoffishness, really, to say, well, our sector is different, so we don't really need to understand the expertise that you've gained within automotive. So that's another example as to how people can, in a more efficient way of looking things, as to how you can remove that singularity of thought and start to widen out the perspectives a little bit, and you'll see a great deal of efficiency based on that if people would start to look at things from that perspective. So I just wanted people to start to widen up the perspective of thought, really, and that's in preparation as to how you're going forward, because there are going to be a whole range of different complicated considerations, and we just need to be a little bit more open to understanding how things work from other people's points of view, and how other people's points of view could actually help us. And once again, it's because I want the feedback from other people as well, because this isn't the Paul ideology. This is people actually understanding how things work together. Now, I am actually going to be starting this week with the F.O.W.E.F.U.N, World Economic Forum and United Nations as the first segment, and I'm doing that purely because I wanted to start off with the slideshow view in the background, because afterwards I'm going to have to move into separate screens. So there's going to be a little bit of controversy around this one, because there's a couple of parts to this, and the first part is, if you remember, I've mentioned how this kind of thing can be subject to a whole range of conspiracy theory and areas of rabbit hole which I'm not interested in going into. It is not. There's plenty of channels out there where people can turn around and tell you that everybody's a devil worshipper and eating babies and whatever. That's entirely up to them. I'm not going to go down those roads, but there is something that I do want to make a little bit clear, because certain people do tend to get in touch with me from time to time and push a particular agenda that I want to make crystal clear I have absolutely no interest in. And that agenda does refer to, it's all the Jews' fault. No, it isn't. No, it bloody well isn't. And I would appreciate it if people didn't send me a whole bunch of crap about how they effectively, and that are a bunch of anti-Semites. I've got no interest in it. I'm really quite furious today, actually, in that, because in doing the preparation for this, I started to have a look at a couple of different things as to how these people abuse the term of Zionism and try to use that as a way of becoming an anti-Semite. I'm not going to be taken in by it, and I will not pay any attention to it. So I'm sure anybody, I'm not going to name names or anything like that. I'm sure you know who you are. I'm not interested. I fully support Israel being able to have their own home. So anybody that's intending to send me any guff around that, I don't want to know. So moving on. I did have a comment that had been made by Lara, I think it was. Yep. Asking about including the World Health Organization within my discussions around the United Nations. So in terms of the first stage of understanding who we're dealing with, rather than do it in the same way that I'm going to be doing with the UK government shortly, I thought I'd just go with a bit of a map that the United Nations produce themselves. This isn't actually, as far as I can see, a full extent map, but as we progress, I'll be going through all this sort of thing. So I want people to understand that when I talk about the United Nations, I'm not just talking about the United Nations. I'm talking about all of the little tentacles that run alongside them and underneath them, and it does include the World Health Organization. So I will be pointing to each and every one of these organisations. I think I'm going to fiddle with myself here. That's not a euphemism. I'm going to push myself up. There we go. Presumably, if the picture is clear enough, you'll be able to see that the World Health Organization is on that list. So yes, I am covering the World Health Organization as well. So just want to be able to understand what the length and breadth of the organisation is that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so I do understand it is going to be included. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail on these things today because, like I say, this is going to be a long form process and we've got plenty of time. The one part that I am going to go into today though is, if it'll move on, there we go. Again, I'm going to move myself up a little bit here, and that because the information that we're interested in is down the bottom. Okay. Now, in terms of just the United Nations as it stands at the moment, the amount of money that they've been receiving. Now, they have 193 members, and so far this year they've received contributions from 106 countries. So there's still 87 to go. They have received in total contributions up to now, I'm going to be putting my head down to look, over 1.8 billion. This doesn't include the US as yet. Their total planned budget with all of the contributions is going to be around $2.8 billion, of which 24% of that, so I mean you might as well just say a quarter of the budget for the United Nations is paid for by the United States. So the thing to understand there is the true level of influence of the United States and how potentially good it is if the likes of Trump were to hold them a little bit more to account, until of course they are preferably disbanded. Now, for those that are interested on the UK side, and that we make up 4%, you know, we do like to think that we're a little bit more important than we are, but compared to the US, hell no. Now, these figures here are just for the United Nations. Now, as much as I've got the number down there as saying that the number of staff that the United Nations employ is 44,000, I mean, that would work out at, was it $65,000 each on an annual basis, if that were to be the entire budget for that entire 44,000. But it's not, because there are individual budgets which, as we go forward, and that I will start to demonstrate, individual budgets for each of the tentacles. So the United Nations is receiving monies from around the world at a staggering amount. There is certainly justification as to having first and foremost having an accountability perspective, but then ideally moving forward to either a dismantling or a is setting up of an alternative, because there's been far too much abuse and misuse and overstepping the mark of authority that have come through the United Nations. Those of you that are familiar with Agenda 21 will know that this is something that's been fed through the United Nations. Obviously you'll be familiar with things like Event 201, which conveniently leads into our little scenario at the moment. There are plans and schemes and corruption and all manner of absolute nonsense that go through the United Nations that really do need to be exposed and understood. I'm particularly concerned about things like Agenda 21 because that has developed and developed, and it's done in conjunction with the World Economic Forum now, which essentially was always going to happen. Yeah, there's so many things that you could go into. I'll touch on when I go through to each particular department as to what it is that they're doing. So for the time being, I want you to understand that what at least on the face of it, the structure of the United Nations is, and how much money we're talking about just for the core arm of the United Nations. I will be putting links in the description so you can have a look for yourself in more detail, particularly in case the quality doesn't quite work out and you can't see the figures properly, but it gives you some idea. So in terms of the process of going forward with the United Nations, that is what we will be looking at. And obviously that you can start to look into things yourself, because there's nothing better than looking into details yourself. Just relying on another person and another person's point of view is never going to give you the perspective that is going to assist with your own particular way of looking at things. You have to understand things for yourself, because you may find out that you look through it all out and go, well, this all seems absolutely fine by me, I'm all for it, in which case entirely up to you. So we'll move into the next stage, which is the World Economic Forum. Now the World Economic Forum have been, like I say, they do work in conjunction with the United Nations, and they've been in particularly very much in plain sight, in your face, since this Chinese virus got underway, and releasing their what is stated on the web page, where again I will put a link in the description, that they've put down as a COVID response. Now within the COVID response there's a whole range of things that have got absolutely nothing to do with COVID. I did put a picture of this up last time. I'm repeating it again because it is the most important part. And this is their considerations around global governance and how they seem to think that things are a problem if the people that they don't like have been elected. You know, if the public decide that they're not really interested in the lackeys that they've chosen, not only not allowed to do that. So we shall just go forward with that and look towards governing ourselves from on a global perspective, which is, should we say, undemocratic to say the least. So the point of how I'm going to be approaching looking at the World Economic Forum is to go by the membership. From time to time I may put some information in terms of the actual core organisation itself, but the only reason that the World Economic Forum has any level of clout at all is because of its membership. And when you're looking at a membership, you can't turn around and then say, I'm sorry, I didn't realise, I was just literally doing as I was told. You don't get that get out card when it's something that you've actually paid to participate in, and you've sat in at the meetings that they hold on a regular basis. And it's not just Davos. That is the main one, but they do have regular types of meetings. So there is no I didn't know guff perspective that they could start throwing out to people. So what I want to do is ask the question, if these people think that they are able to run a global governance program, if they think that they are able to be in charge of people, what sort of people are we dealing with? Are they actually the sort of person, people, group, etc., that you'd think, yes, that is somebody of high moral standing. That's a group of people with absolute integrity. We can trust them. Well, we're gonna see, and I'll do this on a case-by-case basis. I do have information on all of the members of the World Economic Forum, and today's first instalment is going to be biting the hand of YouTube, because what we're dealing with here, and that is 3 companies. Obviously everybody knows Google, everybody knows that Google bought YouTube. Maybe most people know this, but then it was broken up again, and that's how you have Alphabet as the kind of like the holding company at the top, and then there's the various companies that they own underneath that, which obviously includes Google, YouTube. There's a whole range of other companies that they own as well. Now, if this is going to be an organisation that is of high moral standing, what you shouldn't be finding is a Wikipedia page which is full of controversy around an organisation that is supposed to be of such moral high standing. Now, obviously Wikipedia aren't exactly the bastion of truth, I know that much. But I have checked the information, and you, again, link in the description, you can take a look for yourself. The extent of real problems that these companies are responsible for, and the complete lack of any kind of moral standing, is exactly what you would expect it to be. I've taken the perspective of showing, I think you can see my mouse. These ones up here, and the key perspectives, which is a company that is continuously pushing what is considered to be a left-wing agenda. The left-wing agenda side of things is basically just using the useful idiots. But when you have all of these people thinking that they are social justice warriors, and we're the most amazing people in the world, and we're going to be able to run things in to a utopian vision, an awful lot of that is going to be a little bit difficult if you're refusing to pay any of your taxes. Now, at a later stage, when I start going through the various elements of government, there could be a question in terms of the justification for the extent, or indeed any taxes whatsoever. But whilst there are the tax regulations in place, you would expect somebody that is pretending to be of very moral high standing to be paying them, and yet they don't anywhere. The top example that we have there, and that is that how Google had paid 11.6 million off the back of a 5.5 billion profit. Now, I do remember when that one came out. I believe that was under Theresa May, and they'd made an announcement on this to say, oh, we've negotiated a deal with Google to get the taxes from them, and it's a great success. Well, it's not a great success, is it? The tax rate is 20%. So basically what you've done is just taken what you've been given. You haven't negotiated a damn thing, because there shouldn't be a negotiation on that. If I have to pay 20%, they have to pay 20%. End of story. So for companies like this to be suggesting that they have the authority, the wisdom to be able to tell the world this is how the future should be laid out, you have to kind of wonder as to what kind of world that would be. But there's a bit more as well. So you have the next page where there's a whole range again of more problems that they are associated with. And it always helps to highlight the more egregious problems. So I figured, okay, sexual misconduct. That does tend to be quite a common problem as well amongst certain types, shall we say. But when they're, it's one thing for somebody to have, I mean, if you've got a large organisation, is there a potential for you to have employed a complete arsehole? Of course there is. But when you try to cover up the arsehole, that's a different matter altogether. So, what we need to be thinking of here, and on a wider perspective, like I say, generally speaking, I'll pick one organisation at a time to highlight some of the things that they've done, because some of the companies and that you will be, or probably won't be, surprised to know, shouldn't be allowed to run a company, let alone run the bloody world. So let's start to understand a little bit of who it is that we're dealing with. Now I will give one little bit of a perspective around the likes of YouTube and Google in terms of the censorship issues. Now, I had thought for a moment to give them a little bit of leeway, a bit of a get-out clause, effectively, to say, well, when it comes down to censorship, what we're generally seeing is a lot of people complaining, so well, there's an awful lot of right-wing content that is being shadow banned, demonetised, that's the word, and in certain instances completely removed. And I think, well, there have been calls for a long time now over a range of different content to be removed from all sides. The obvious example is around terrorism and paedophilia, things of this nature. And so it had started to make me wonder a little bit to say, well, if we're saying that they're being overly censorious to a range of different people who are using the standard line of saying, well, you know, it's freedom of speech. Well, you can't have it both ways, really. You can't turn around and say, well, okay, this is freedom of speech, therefore a terrorist should be able to spew this nonsense. Because a terrorist can spew nonsense without the incitement to hatred. It will be in a roundabout way, but they can be a little bit clever around that. So you have to be a little bit careful around that. But the problem that arises, as I don't know if you remember this, but when these conversations were taking place around the ease of access to terrorist content and paedophile content and things of this nature, and a real conversation started to take place in political circles and then in the public sphere, the response that we got from the likes of Google, it does include others who I will touch on at a later stage, but just concentrate with these companies for the time being. They said that it was very difficult to be able to identify each particular source, because they've got so much content coming on. It's difficult for them to set up an algorithm to be able to identify, and how they've been setting up this sort of like a kind of like a red flag system. but they couldn't just blanket get rid of all of that type of content as quickly as people would like it to be removed. Well, they don't seem to have had that level of problem when it comes down to removing conservative views. So if you have a system set up where you're saying that you understand that there's limits to free speech, fine, I haven't got a problem with that. But then at the same time, you can remove an entirely rational political ideology perspective. I think is probably more suited. I don't think it's an ideology anymore. Conservative views being quashed to the extent that it is, but you can't do anything about the paedophiles. That's a little bit bizarre, to say the least. So, something for you to think about when you're dealing with organisations like the World Economic Forum, when you're dealing with organisations like the United Nations. You have to understand who it is that you're actually talking about, and whether you would actually want to have any level of influence from these people. Right, for the more observant of you, you will notice there was a little bit of an interlude there, and I had actually been intending to do everything in one take as normal, but I fucked it up, so I'm having to do this second segment again. Shit happens, you know, and there's a few glasses of wine more involved now, so who knows what you're going to get. Right, I wanted to do this second segment, which is supposed to be the core part of the programme. I'll try to keep the time down because I'm conscious of going too long, which I had done previously. I went something like about an hour and a half, which was ridiculously long. So the part here is in reference to work that I showed last week, which was what the government actually looks like. So what I wanted to do is bring that back to the beginning, because that was work that was done around about a year, 18 months ago. And I wanted to be able to say, well, let me show you how this is actually undertaken. Where do you look? How do you go about it? And then you get some idea as to which departments you want to get a better overview of before you start developing the process and putting it into the mapping system. So with the UK government, it is quite simple in terms of just putting into, obviously now I've got the DuckDuckGo here, and that you just put it into UK government departments, and right at the top it will give you the page that takes you through to the link, and you'll have all the departments and agencies listed with a reasonable amount of transparency. If you have that with all countries or not, don't know. I don't have the time to run through every single country in the world. I have done something similar to that in the past, where it was based on trade related bodies, and even down to bloody fag, even down to countries like Armenia, the extent of transparency was actually exceptionally good. I'm sure there are countries that are not quite as open anymore. You'll have some usual suspects that don't really want to show you too much, but in terms of the UK and most countries, you'll probably find it absolutely fine. Now, if you do come across any issues within your own particular country, feel free to just sort of write a message or something like that. If I can help in any way, I'll do what I can within reason. So, because of what I'd done the year 18 months ago, was the picture of the government at that time, I want to be able to bring it up to date, and so I can run through this process with you, so you're following all of the steps that I take before I start laying things out in map format and following a process, so you understand exactly every step that it is that I'm taking. So what I had done before having the map was laying everything out in an Excel sheet, which is essentially something that you can see down the side here. what I'd done previously was put my face straight over the top of the Excel sheet, which obviously makes everything pointless. So I'm over the other side now. Now you've got, within the government as it stands at the moment, you have the declaration of 24 departments. Previously there'd been 25. The only one that's been taken out is the department for Brexit, basically. No big shakes around that, not a problem. I'm going to try to run through this as quickly as I can, because I did, like I say, I did run over far too long before. Now, when it comes down to understanding what the government is, the size, everything that they do, part of it is understanding, at least from my perspective now, understanding the perspective of where we were a year or so ago and what changes have taken place now. The reason why that becomes relevant is there's been articles floating around LinkedIn, particularly today, over an announcement from Boris Johnson to set up a panel to examine judicial reviews. There's been a few other levels of evolvement within governments that have not been quite so widely publicised, and probably usually never are. And this is kind of why I know it's difficult for people to constantly be keeping on top of everything, but just a check every now and again to see what government looks like at the moment, so that as you are running through the process, that becomes essentially part of the lessons learned, where it does become a bit of a pain in the ass because you have to change the map, but the lessons learned are, this is where it was before. What were the functions? What did it do? Does it hold value? Things of this nature. So you can start to run those two things in parallel. So from the previous time, like I say, 24 ministerial departments down to, 25 down to 24. Within each department, there's also been changes. I'm going to skip through that to make sure things don't go too long. There's a very important one that's taken place, and the screens will change a little bit here and that, but within the Cabinet Office itself, there's 23 agencies listed here. There had previously been 20. One of the most important changes is that they've brought in the UK Statistics Authority. Now, you'd have to ask yourself, why would that be? It's not as if there's been anything going on lately to make anybody wonder what's going on with statistics, is there? That's something that I think that we're going to need to pay a bit of attention to. In terms of taking things forward and what levels of responsibility government should have, including the Statistics Authority, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. Because if a government is going to have proper oversight, then understanding the level of data extraction and and how the statistics are put together, understanding all of that makes sense. The problem I've got with it is the fact that it's suddenly been put forward now, at a time when there's been the issue over what the deaths are and what the cases are, and that from the China virus, and the fact that they've been classifying deaths in particular to people that have died from influenza, people that have been run over and all this sort of stuff, and yet they haven't actually reflected that, shall we say, intentional error in the numbers to date. Now, I know that because I run the figures every day, so though today I'm lagging behind. So it's a two-pronged perspective. That first and foremost is, when you've got the right level of oversight at the right level of government, potentially a good thing. That means that they understand what's going on. Potential downfall of that, potential problem with that, is that it then enables people to have political influence as to how the statistics are gathered and read, and then presented to the public. So, Is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Pros and cons, we shall see. Timing isn't exactly the best, though, is it? They've also brought into the Cabinet Office. So anything that's coming into the Cabinet Office, and that is going to be considered to be of more national importance, essentially. There's going to be more responsibility from the various ministers. They've also brought in the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, as well as the Government Equalities Office. That sort of thing. You're going to have your people that think that that's a wonderful idea. I'm not one of them. Everything is supposed to be, everybody's equal under the law. This type of stuff, I think, actually creates far more disparity and problems than it ever seeks to solve. But, you know, these are the changes that have been taking place. So when you're looking through the extent of government at the moment, before we move through to actually mapping things out, you start to see how things can shift, and where you can, at the right point in the future, look towards having like little side notes, lessons learned, risks, things of this nature. So I'm going to speed through because of how long I took on my first cock up. Another change is within the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. So let's bring that one up on here. Actually, I did say in my previous edit, I'd made mention of the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It is one of there's a number of departments that's going to be incredibly important to look at in a serious amount of detail. Never going to be able to be done in one episode. There are no changes in that particular department, but the reason why I want people to be thinking about that department, and the reason why I want to highlight that department, is because there's an awful lot of activity that takes place there that I think the vast majority of the public are not really aware of. There are areas there that are incredibly important in terms of how you develop the nation's infrastructure and things of this nature. You have people that will think that all of these things should be done in the private sector in order for it to be efficient. Not entirely convinced of that, but again, that's part of the conversation as we move forward. But there are parts within it where it literally does have to be a partnership between the government and the private sector, and it's the level of partnership between the two that is where the concentration needs to be. Because once you start delving into these things, you will find some of the stuff that I've had involvement with in the past. There's certain amounts of money, and large amounts of money, that end up going into the private sector for things that you probably wouldn't think are justifiable. For example, like research and development. To a degree, it kind of makes sense, but I suppose my key problem with it, on the experience that I've had with it, would be not so much that it shouldn't be done, more a case of that the oversight and the way that it is awarded can be a potential problem. Some companies that really justifiably do not deserve to have taxpayers' money effectively are given access to grants which are somewhat excessive and could be better distributed to smaller, more efficient, more innovative and larger growth potential prospective companies. So the notion of government being independent from business, it just doesn't happen. So how the two work together, what kind of policies work within this particular department, and how it can help essentially develop GDP overall, and increase jobs, etc. It does become a very, very, very important department as far as I'm concerned. But I'll let you look through this and figure it out for yourself. Right, so the one that I was looking at, the Department for Digital. Right, a few changes within this one. They've included the Charity Commission all of a sudden. Not entirely sure what the fit is there. Charities do need to have a large amount of oversight. I'm not, like I say, when we're running through the processes and starting to map things out, we will have these discussions. But I'm not convinced that this is the right department for it to be sat within. But charities do need to have regulation and oversight, because when you're sitting down and you see these commercials that says, "Oh, we'll just give £5 a month, just give £3 a month," 9 times out of 10, it's getting worse and worse that they don't even say where they're supposed to be operating, who they're supposed to be helping, and all that sort of stuff. It seems to be poverty porn, basically. And the vast majority of the money that you hand over to these organisations does not go to the people that they're claiming it does go to. I might do something on that at a later date. There's plenty to get through. So, Charity Commission, having that included, debatable, we shall see. There is something in here around the Church's Conservation Trust. The church, whether it be the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England, these are organisations that have got enormous assets. And I know that you'll see your local church and that, and the vicar or whatever they're called sat there saying, we need to raise money to fix the church roof. These organisations have got staggeringly large amounts of money. So why the public would be getting involved in conserving churches is, again, a question to be thought about in the future. There's something called the Phone Paid-In Services Authority. That's something I'm going to have to look into more detail as we're going forward, because of these developments that people are obviously going to be getting concerned around 5G. Another matter for a separate conversation. They've got rid of the UK Council for Internet Safety, which it was never the best name in the first place, but it's the matter of what they're looking to replace it with and which departments it should sit behind. Personally, I don't think, again, that this is the right department to be sat in. It's got to be within. I understand digital and so forth, and that tying it to the internet, but these are more legal matters than anything else. So potentially even sat under the Home Office. But like I say, this is the type of stuff that you look at to understand what your government actually consists of. If I can get my words out. Now, running down further, like I said, I'm trying to speed things up from the previous attempt that I did. There's the inclusion of Crossrail International to the Department of Transport. Yeah, not a big deal. Why they call these things international is beyond me. We've got things like Ashford International, Ebbsfleet International, Stratford International. There's nothing bloody international about them. No doubt it's legal, financial purposes. But once we're understanding the structure of government and what changes we want to make and all that sort of stuff, might make this sort of stuff redundant. Now, Department for Health and Social Care. Here comes the NHS. Anybody that's outside the UK might understand the fact that the UK has essentially started to become the NHS with a little country called the UK attached to it. There's a problem with this, and it was a problem that started on March the 23rd anyway, when we entered into lockdown, because the government brought in new legislation which effectively removed the right to recourse. So you could have medical malpractice within the NHS, and up until now, I mean, if you look at last year's budget, around half of that budget is allocated towards litigation and the medical malpractice, because it happens so bloody often. Now, on March the 23rd, when they changed this legislation, they effectively removed that right to recourse. They said that any level of medical malpractice that takes place for 2 years, you don't get the opportunity to be able to sue them, basically. Now, in that 2-year period, and why that would be a 2-year period, at least for the time being, that's when you're expecting the vaccines to come out. Now, a vaccine that comes out which has not gone through the correct testing procedure, if it causes any significant disability, if it really has a severe negative effect, the minimum amount that you're entitled to straight away is £120,000. I do know from family friends that somebody that's had a similar sort of issue and it ran into multiple millions. Obviously that level of issue for the government and the amount of money that they've been spending for an organisation that is so piss poorly operated, it's getting more and more expensive. So when you've got something that's being run through and demanding everybody take these bloody vaccinations and so forth, to remove that level of liability is truly staggering. And what they've done in the agencies is they've removed the NHS litigation authority, and they've replaced it with something called the NHS resolution. That doesn't sound good, and it's going to require looking at in more detail. Again, you're not seeing anything on the news about this, but then they didn't cover the fact that March the 23rd removed the right to recourse as well. That's a little bit concerning. So if you have people out there that are, I mean, whether you're pro-vaccine or against the vaccine, to understand that they've removed responsibility, that should concern anybody. So that's one to pay attention to. So it's moving down a little bit. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I've highlighted a couple in pink here and that because there's no change there. I just find it a little bit, well, one of them I find unusual and the other one I want to give a little bit more information on. You've got the Great Britain China Centre. Why would the Foreign and Commonwealth Office have something dedicated to Britain-China relationships and no other country? That's a bit of an unusual thing. I know that within the Trade Department you have the offices and so forth and that operate from the embassies to assist trade, obviously, across the world, but they don't have their own centre, so to speak. That's a bit of an unusual one, and that might require a little bit more investigation when we're doing the mapping. And then the other one is the F.O.W.E.F.U.N Scholarship. I had this problem last time. The F.O.W.E.F.U.N Scholarship Programme. Now, for the conspiracy theorists will love this one. This is a programme to help get certain individuals into universities, which means that the people behind this programme have access to a range of different universities across the UK, including the top universities. One of the key sponsors behind this, and the relationships with this come through the Open Society, which means they're getting money and giving access to a certain Mr. George Soros. I have on other databases the meetings that have previously taken place with the likes of Jeremy Hunt, say that carefully, Michael Gove and so forth. They are granting access to these people. So when you're sitting back and wondering why universities are essentially the hotbeds for indoctrination programs, idiots, and rewriting history and basically doing a 1984 job, it's down to the access that people like this are gaining with the universities, and that as long as they're getting the money, they don't seem to really care. Not really a smart way of doing things. Treasury. I've got the inclusion now of the Government Actuaries Department. The finance side of things, and that is something that we'll be looking at it. There's certain departments that when we look at it, there's going to be a very large amount of detail that we're going to need to concentrate on, because you'll never get through it in one of these programs, and it is going to require a lot of feedback from various people. Like I say, this is not the Paul ideology. As much as I can provide some input to each one of these different departments, and I can provide some suggestions, it would be ridiculous for me to say, just based on my opinion alone, what all these different organisations should be reformed to look like, especially when you're coming around to things like taxation. So again, when you're running through this stuff for yourself, when you're familiarising yourself with this government or with your own government in another country, pay attention to what's included within it, so that you can get some understanding as to what you need to be looking at in the future. Home Office Adjudicator's Office is a new inclusion there. Obviously within the Home Office, and that you're looking towards various areas of national security and all this sort of stuff. I do wonder whether that's going to have some level of influence to this judicial review. Potentially might. So again, something to keep an eye on. And here within the Home Office, we've now got the inclusion of the communications and data authorizations. So let me show it here somewhere, right down in the bottom. Yeah, Office for Communication Data Authorizations. As we're moving forward, they've had the problems with the likes of Huawei. It does kind of make a little bit of sense that, as much as there are issues around 5G, I'll leave that for other people to talk about. I do have concerns, but like I say, I'll leave it. Because it is down to national security, it does make a little bit of sense for the Home Office to have some level of oversight there. So I can kind of understand why that's been put in, and whether it has some relevance as to why the Intelligence Services Commissioner and the UK Council for Internet Safety here as well, whether this is in relation to a replacement for those two departments, something that we need to keep an eye out on. Within the Ministry of Defence, a lot of people will be quite pleased to see that you've got the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust included, long overdue. Probably needs to be a little bit more involved there, and that's in terms of the Justice Department and calling a halt to a lot of the legal vultures that are out there. within the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, we have a department that has been removed, which is the Planning Inspectorate. That's an unusual one. Obviously, when we've got things like the people out there that understand, what's her name, Rosa Corey, I think it is, that's given the perspectives on Agenda 21 and how there is going to be the land and asset grab, essentially. Removing the planning inspectorate doesn't really chime with that. That does seem to be opening things up to more development. Don't know. Again, something that we're going to be having to look at in more detail. Now, the one thing that I want people to understand with this as well is that from statistics elsewhere, I won't be putting too much information in the in all of the links, description links and so forth, because I don't want to override people. But all you need to understand is that around the world, built environment is less than 3%. In the UK, I think it's around about 2.7%. There is room for development. There's not been an awful lot of development that has taken place around the UK in terms of developing new towns and things of this nature since Milton Keynes in the I think that was done in the 70s. You can see within this particular department there is the F.O.W.E.F.U.N Development Corporation, which is the newest town that they are developing, enabling some level of leeway for that kind of development to take place. I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. The only area where there might be a level of concern is to make sure that the quality and the infrastructure around it is done in a rational and well thought out manner. That's kind of where I would expect the planning inspectorate to have a purpose. It's been removed, something that we might need to keep an eye on. Ministry of Justice, Margaret, that's going to be a very difficult conversation to take place. Again, it'll be broken down piece by piece in order to be able to map things out correctly. Personally, I think there's an awful lot of laws that are going to need to be just completely removed, but there's certain things that do need to be simplified. The obvious ones are the legal system and the tax system. It's far too much involvement there from parties that probably shouldn't be involved. Things can be made more complicated in order to skirt around it. So those will be quite involved conversations. And then we're moving into like the more devolved governments. And then we've got into things like the non-ministerial departments, 20 of them. Okay. We will run through each of those piece by piece. No real problems there as far as I can see, at least in terms of any anomalies. What we would actually do with them in a planning process, different matter altogether. The next part that's of because again, remember, within the UK and that you're dealing with a Conservative government, which is supposed to be keeping things as efficient as possible. And anybody that tells me that we don't live in as near a damn it socialist country in the UK, they're just really not paying attention. There used to be 405 of these agencies under the other public bodies. There's now 411. So they're growing. None of it makes sense. Some of these, again, it's agencies that are under the auspices of other ministerial departments. So what I will be doing within the mapping process is making sure that there is the direct link, so that we're not doubling up, which does tend to happen when government does this type of thing. So we'll be able to streamline things a little bit easier just through that process alone. There's nothing really that I can recall that stands out dramatically, but again, it's the key problem here, and that is the size, the sheer size of this, and the amount of bureaucracy that you're looking at. It's it's not something that you should really be expecting your government to be doing. So, well, some people might expect it. Oh, here's the good one. What we're now accustomed to, a department that didn't exist previously, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE. That's one that we're really going to have to look at, because if they're going to be doing that on a case-by-case basis, where it's not just down to ailments. So, for example, you might have a SAGE group on climate change, which means that you're going to end up with a room full of absolute numpties that know nothing. That's an area where we need to look at, because SAGE in and of itself doesn't actually come from the UK. This is not a UK department name that they've come up with themselves. It does have a history elsewhere. They've just simply copied it. Slightly worrying perspectives on that one, but we'll deal with that. Now, I'm trying to run through as quick as I can because I've gone aware of too much time. Essentially, you can see that it's a very, very, very large government that we should be looking towards. Well, I'm sure that we can make this an awful lot better, and consider it to our resources, capabilities, providing assistance where it's required in a more efficient manner, in a more professional manner, so that things don't get held back, they don't become too much of a bureaucracy, and we can hopefully start having a sensible conversation as what people's governments are going to look like. And like, as I said, within each different country, you can do it according to what your culture requires. Now, the end piece on this, because you'll remember from the first episode, I just basically said goodbye and that was it, it stopped. I do have an end sequence that I would appreciate if you did actually hold on for. It's called the Moirai directory. Moirai is, again, another one of these Greek mythology. It's the three sisters who held the strings that everybody in the world was effectively, they were the puppets, these were the strings, these were the orchestrators of the strings. I've used that term specifically because I like the fact that I can take the piss a little bit and that and go with a bit of doublespeak, because there's going to be some companies listed who are cutting those strings. They're doing the exact opposite, so hence the doublespeak. And these are companies that are looking to be just professional in what it is that they do. They're not interested in pushing somebody else's agenda. They're not interested in pandering to whatever's going to be taking place this week and whoever wants to do whatever, cancel culture and all the rest of it. They just want to do the best job that they can, provide the best service that they can, and not only provide a business and an income for themselves, but create jobs and create a benefit to society as a whole, which I think is an admirable quality. I know that because it includes my company as well. But stick with it, stick to the end, have a look and see the companies. If there's anything that they're providing that would be of use to you, great, get in touch with them. These are not paid advertisements. There is no monetization to any of this. Levels of monetization as to what I do with this in the future, and that's up in the air at the moment. But have a look at it, have a think about all of the things that I've discussed in this episode, and I'll see you in the next one, where I try to take things forward that little step further as we try to understand what the hell it is that we're going to be doing. All right, take care, bye bye.